It's one of the most powerful and prominent paintings ever known, The Birth of Venus by Sandro Botticelli, and you probably won't find a more renowned depiction of feminine beauty on the entire planet. But yet, something so familiar, so easily explained, remains shrouded in a dense fog of mystery. Today, you can see her on a beach towel, on a keychain, on a jean jacket, on earrings, on a lighter, and even in the form of a weird Funko Pop-looking keychain. Venus is absolutely everywhere. But who is this woman? Yeah, she is Venus, even though this doesn't actually show the birth of Venus at all. I mean, who is she really? And why does her face pop up again and again and again in works by the same artist? And how is it that the man who brought her to life went from being one of the most acclaimed artists of his time to flushing his career, setting his own paintings on fire, and dying in utter obscurity? What follows is a tale of a fake name, gangs of creepy kids, castration, hair spun of gold, and unrequited love deeper than the ocean that gave birth to a woman riding on a seashell. Welcome to Renaissance Florence, the coolest town in Europe at the time, and probably the coolest in the whole world. It's a place where you might bump into Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci heading off to enjoy a fresh pizza. Well, they didn't really eat pizza back then, but I bet they would have loved it. Among the many famous artists and poets of Florence was a man named Sandro Botticelli, which isn't even his actual name. His real name was Alessandro di Mariano di Vanni Filippi. No, Botticelli wasn't a stage name. It's not like how Tom Cruise's real name is Tom Mapother.
Absolutely.
You see, for those named Alessandro, Sandro was a common nickname. And as for the other part, it's because he often hung around his older brother, whom many called Botticello, meaning barrel, due to his shape. Botticelli is the plural, so many have come to translate it as Little Barrel. The young Botticelli spent his early years apprenticed in an entirely different craft, but he wanted more. His father gave in and sent him to learn from Fra Filippo Lippi, one of the best artists in Florence. Maybe a bit like how Tom Mapother was once an apprentice in the guild of a certain religion.
Put your manners back in.
But make no mistake, painting was hard. Learning to mix pigments with eggs, studying how fabric flows on the body, examining anatomy, assisting his master by helping with the backgrounds. Botticelli's talent was put to the test, and success was never a guarantee. So, what happened? He exploded onto the scene. He forged a name for himself, taking commissions, fulfilling contracts, painting portraits, decorating churches, creating religious art for wealthy patrons all across Florence. In this town, there were few commodities hotter than him. We get a lot of our knowledge on Botticelli and many other artists of the time from an artist and writer named Giorgio Vasari, whom some consider to be the world's first art historian. Now, Vasari was writing about 40 years after Botticelli and describes the man in his younger years as a fun-loving prankster. Some of the biography is a bit, unflattering, and we'll be getting to the reasons why. It stands in stark contrast to his fawning over Leonardo and Michelangelo. But despite his rather judgmental opinions, Vasari can't help but rave about one particular work by Botticelli. This is the Adoration of the Magi, showing the wise men visiting baby Jesus.
In it the first old man, overcome by tenderness as he kisses the foot of our Lord, expresses so much emotion that it is clear he has reached the end of his long journey.
Vasari goes on to praise the variety of faces in the crowd, saying their beauty is beyond description.
They are turned in various poses, some full face, some in profile, some in three-quarter profile, and some gazing downward, with a wide variety of attitudes and expressions on the faces of young and old alike, including all those imaginative details that reveal the artist's perfect mastery of his craft. This is truly a marvelous painting. Every artisan of our day is still amazed by the beauty of its coloring, design, and composition.
And here, over on the side, Botticelli himself, gazing out at us as if to say, look at this. Look at what I was able to accomplish. Botticelli was a superstar. He became so well known he was summoned by none other than the Pope himself and asked to paint this, and this, and this. Where? On the walls of the Sistine Chapel in Rome, at a time when Michelangelo was only a child. And not too long after, Botticelli paints 4 of his most famous paintings, if not his most famous paintings, period. Primavera, Pallas and the Centaur, Venus and Mars, and of course, the birth of Venus. All 4 share one thing in common, one face in common. Before we talk about who this is, we should probably discuss the what, as in what we're actually looking at. Because, as I said, this isn't actually the birth of Venus at all. Instead, it's the arrival of Venus on the shores of the island of Cyprus after her birth. As for her birth itself, it's your typically gross and perverted mythological tale. Well, by our standards anyway. Venus is the goddess of love from Roman mythology. And as we all know, the Romans totally ripped off the Greeks in every way they possibly could. It's kinda like how a Transformers movie comes out, then someone makes one called Transmorphers with no Shia LaBeouf.
You should get to the point.
Hoping to trick the elderly. So the Greek version of Venus is Aphrodite, which I think we can agree is a much cooler name. As for her birth, the Titan Kronos cut off the, private area of his father Uranus and flung it into the sea. This from Hesiod, the ancient Greek poet.
And so soon as he had cut off the members with flint and cast them from the land into the surging sea, they were swept away over the main a long time, and a white foam spread around them from the immortal flesh, and in it there grew a maiden.
Keep in mind, this is just one of multiple stories. Ancient mythology is often as confusing as the Transmorphers. After being born from the sea foam, Venus arrives on the shore in a shell, which in Roman times was often a symbol for the private area of a woman. Don't ask me to explain that one. By the way, you often see the Virgin Mary depicted with a seashell, which may or may not have its roots in the story of Venus, depending on what you believe. Venus is blown to her destination by Zephyr, god of the wind, who's intertwined with a figure that's likely Aura, the breeze. She's then welcomed on shore by Hora, one of the seasons, either spring or summer, offering a blanket. Now to me, this is every bit as unimportant as Tom Mapother's early movies. What's really key here is that this is considered to be the first full-size painted female nude since ancient times. Instead of depictions of nudity as something shameful, reserved for Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden, or tortured souls in hell, here's a woman who's slightly covering herself but doesn't seem ashamed. The pose itself likely comes from ancient statues of Aphrodite, and there's no doubt this painting was special to Botticelli. After all, he used real gold to paint parts of it, including Venus's hair. It's hard to see in photos, but I took this one when I saw the painting in Florence, and hopefully it gives you an idea of how the light reflects off of it. In his own way, Botticelli was continuing a medieval tradition of using gold leaf in paintings, and he was no stranger to the metal. Remember that other career path? Botticelli was apprenticed to his brother, the Big Barrel, who was a goldsmith. It's likely the birth of Venus was commissioned as a wedding gift for a member of the Medici family, the extremely wealthy bankers and art patrons of Florence. Giorgio Vasari said he saw both the birth of Venus and Primavera in a Medici villa, and Botticelli painted the Medici family in his adoration of the Magi. And let's be clear on one thing. These works were different. The Renaissance itself was a revelation, a new wave of art. Instead of the stiff, improbable images of the Gothic period, we see elegantly posed figures, showing off the artist's understanding of anatomy. Instead of flat, two-dimensional images, we see a use of perspective, with clearly charted lines and objects that recede into the background. And yet, much of that is absent in Botticelli's mythological paintings. The figures are basically on the same plane and almost look like cardboard cutouts with thick lines around them. No one casts any shadows. The landscape in the background is skewed and unrealistic. The perspective is unnatural. Or look at Venus herself. Her neck is elongated and the pose is impossible for a human to hold.
The rules are being broken here.
So this must have been intentional. Many believe it's because this is pagan art. Botticelli painted Christian scenes in a more realistic way because to him, those things actually happened. This didn't, and therefore it's more of a dreamscape. A purposeful dreamscape, maybe one into which Botticelli would have liked to have escaped. Like the girl in the video for the song Take On Me. There, the two could frolic on the beach, far from the troubles of Florence, slowly learning that life is okay. But who was she? Renaissance Florence, the coolest city in the world, where you might find Michelangelo or Leonardo or an imaginary pizza. Famous families on every corner. Botticelli himself grew up with some rather renowned neighbors, the Vespuccis. Now, don't tell me you've never heard of them, because you definitely have. Among their ranks was an explorer named Amerigo Vespucci, and a few prominent places bear his name. His first name, that is. It's not called the United States of Vespucci. This is his cousin through marriage, Simonetta Vespucci, or we think this is her, in a painting by Botticelli. So is this. Simonetta was famed for being the most beautiful woman in all of Florence. Likely from the Italian city of Genoa, she met one of the Vespuccis at church and they were promptly married. I mean, not that same day in that same church, a little later. Though specifics on her life are a bit scant, she became quite popular among the elite of Florence. One of her most well-documented appearances took place here, outside the Church of Santa Croce, though it looked a bit different back then. The year was 1475. Medici brothers, Lorenzo and Giuliano, those wealthy bankers who were basically the rulers of Florence, put on a jousting tournament to celebrate an alliance between Florence, Milan, and Venice. Giuliano was one of the competitors. He carried with him a now lost banner supposedly painted by Botticelli, featuring Simonetta as the Greek goddess Pallas Athena, the same as in this painting. At the bottom of the banner, Botticelli painted the words, "The Unparalleled One." Now, some have said Giuliano was having an affair with Simonetta. That's a whole other story. Just as is a story of how one day Giuliano went to Mass at Santa Maria del Fiore and got stabbed 19 times and had a sword stuck through his head. As for the affair, there's evidence both ways. But if you were a wealthy dude sleeping with the wife of another wealthy dude, would you run around on a horse waving a flag with her face on it? Probably not. It's more likely that this was an example of medieval courtly love, where a knight performs acts of service for a noblewoman. Of course, Giuliano won the tournament, serving as an example of how great women can inspire great men to achieve greatness. There's no written record of who Botticelli chose to serve as his Venus, and while the similarities in the faces of his mythological paintings are well documented, it seems to go much further than that. You see the same face in many of his Christian paintings as well. And as we've noted, even Botticelli's critics have praised his ability to paint faces, so it's not like he didn't know how to paint someone else. And we see her face more than once in the very same painting. We even see her with Giuliano here, and here, next to a lance one would use for jousting. But there's one piece of information I left out. In the year 1476, only 1 year after that jousting tournament, Simonetta Vespucci died, likely of tuberculosis. She was just 22. And all of these paintings came long after that. Now, there was this idea of an artist needing a muse, someone to inspire you, someone to spur you on to greatness, whether it be writing a poem or chiseling marble or winning a jousting tournament. So was that it, or was it something more? Would Botticelli have clung to this ethereal image for years, for decades, if she didn't surpass the mere role of muse? And if you notice something these paintings have in common besides the face, they all place a woman in a superior position, up on a pedestal. The males are in the background, or looking away, or fast asleep, or being dominated. Certainly, Botticelli and Simonetta knew each other. It's nearly impossible that they wouldn't. They lived in the same neighborhood and moved in the same circles, so perhaps her face simply became an example of feminine beauty and nothing more. Or perhaps he didn't love her at all, but used the idea of her as a muse, awakening his creativity. But there's always another perhaps. Perhaps she was a fleeting, unattainable, and intangible woman who became even more enticing and idealized in death. Permanently unattainable and therefore even more desirable. as images of her swelled from the sea foam of his mind. Perhaps the loss of her was so damaging, all he could do was give her the greatest gift he could, immortality, through art. Perhaps he tried to cover the pain with paint as a temporary antidote to his suffering, and perhaps it wasn't enough. Perhaps it left him vulnerable to someone else, filling the void. Welcome to the convent of San Marco. Definitely not the coolest place in Florence. This is where Dominican friars would sit in quiet meditation, and where one particular friar by the name of Savonarola would sit and rage over everything that was wrong with the world. Here's the very spot where he spent many an hour in deep, angry contemplation. You see, Savonarola had some bones to pick. His mind swirled with apocalyptic visions, and he hated fun. You know, the things he saw as bringing about the moral degradation of society. Things like music and love poems and hairbrushes. No word on whether or not he wanted to ban dancing. One of Savonarola's main targets was the church itself, which he saw as being corrupt. And if we're going to be fair to him, he was kind of right. A lot of his complaints were shared by those who split off in the Protestant Reformation. By all accounts, Savonarola was quite the charismatic speaker, and his popularity grew when he convinced the invading King of France to leave Florence alone. And with the death of Lorenzo de' Medici, it was Savonarola who essentially became the leader of Florence. Crowds swelled to over 10,000, so big he started having his sermons under the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore. His fans were called piagnoni, meaning weepers, and among them, Sandro Botticelli. Well, that's what Giorgio Vasari says anyway.
He was apparently a follower of Savonarola's faction, which led him to abandon painting. Unable to make enough to live on, he fell into the direst of straits. Nevertheless, he obstinately remained a member of this faction and became a piagnoni, as they were called in those days, which kept him away from his work.
Savonarola began cracking down on what he saw as the ethical deterioration of Florence, sending out these gangs of creepy little kids to make sure people were behaving. Part of this involved collecting vanities, things like mirrors or immoral books or, well, inappropriate art. And it culminated in what's called the bonfire of the vanities, where these sinful objects were set on fire. In many ways, this was a rejection of everything the Renaissance stood for: rediscovery of the ancient past, free thinking, the things embraced by the Medici and those Botticelli spent time with. There are stories of Botticelli setting his own art on fire. Are they true? Well, there's an argument to be made that Botticelli wouldn't have owned much of the art he'd created, but he did run a studio which would have had paintings in progress. So there's no telling how many masterpieces like The Birth of Venus may have gone up in smoke. Eventually, Savonarola picked one too many fights with the Pope, and he was hanged. And then he was burned, quite publicly, right in the very same square as his bonfires. His ashes were cast into the river, and Botticelli was, once again, alone. Sandro Botticelli was adrift. His art changed. He changed. Now, what was happening in the depths of his mind is a matter of speculation, but it's difficult to argue that his style didn't shift. Take a look at this, known as the Outcast. Its meaning is a bit murky, but I don't see how you could look at this alongside every other piece we've seen and say this was painted by the same man. It's neither formal nor fanciful, it's simply despair. He paints crucifixions, he paints lamentations, and even Mary and the baby Jesus simply seem sad. Certainly people were paying him to paint specific scenes. That's how art worked back then for most, if not all of these. But why was he choosing these commissions? And it's not like this was entirely new for him. Botticelli had been painting darker scenes for many years, kind of on the side, for an illustrated edition of Dante's Divine Comedy. For whatever reason, he never finished. Which brings us here, a work called The Mystic Nativity, the only painting Botticelli ever signed. It's believed it wasn't a commission at all, but something he simply painted for himself, and, well, it's bizarre. At first glance, what you might notice is how some of the figures are way out of proportion. It's almost like Botticelli was regressing, rejecting the Renaissance and ripping art back in a reversion to medieval times, when painting some larger than others was a way of emphasizing their importance. On the left, the three wise men, no longer depicted as kings, but plain, no vanity, as Savonarola would have wanted. Below, demons bury themselves in the underworld. Above, 12 circling angels surrounded by ribbons, the words on them now mostly vanished. They once referred to words spoken by Savonarola. Atop in Greek, references to what Botticelli calls the troubles of Italy. Though this haunting image of the birth of Christ may seem impenetrably peculiar, it's clearly referencing one of Savonarola's apocalyptic visions. This was also seemingly not painted as a commission. It's called the Mystic Crucifixion. Dark clouds roll in. An angel prepares to slay a symbol of Florence. In the background, Florence itself. And while some of these works may seem to be a return to form, like this one, look more closely. It's based on a lost ancient Greek painting. Here, figures named Ignorance and Suspicion surround King Midas. Here, an innocent man dragged by his hair, possibly another reference to Savonarola and his fate. And here, clad in black, a figure named Repentance stands next to a more familiar figure, one called Truth. But what was the truth? Giorgio Vasari has a bit to say about these final years. He claims Botticelli was so poor he would have starved to death if it wasn't for assistance from friends of Lorenzo de' Medici.
He earned a great deal of money, but wasted all of it badly through poor management and carelessness. Finally, after he had grown old and useless and had to walk with two canes, since he could no longer stand upright, he died sick and decrepit at the age of 78, and he was buried in the year 1515 in Ognissanti.
Was Vasari telling the truth? We have no way to be sure, but it is true that Botticelli fell out of favor towards the end of his life. Whether it was because of his association with Savonarola or because his work was simply out of style, he wasn't exactly celebrated. He never married, and eventually, he was forgotten. His works weren't discussed, or visited, or admired. In fact, in 1874, the National Gallery in London bought Venus and Mars for just over 1,000 British pounds. That gift of immortality evaporated. The birth of Venus died. But right around the same time, Botticelli was being rediscovered by a group of British painters known as the Pre-Raphaelites. Just as he found inspiration from the ancient world, they found inspiration in him. And perhaps by doing so, they were resurrecting those very ideas Botticelli himself had forgotten. As for that place where Botticelli was buried, the Church of Ognissanti in Florence, it also happens to be the very same place where Simonetta Vespucci was laid to rest. As the story goes, he asked to be buried at her feet. Is the story true, or is it just a romantic tale conjured up by those struck by the coincidence that this was the neighborhood church for both Sandro and Simonetta? I suppose you could ask the same questions about much of his life, or most of history itself. But when your face is on a sweatshirt or a candle, when people file by you in the Sistine Chapel, when your every feature is known by countless millions, well, if that's not living forever, then I don't know what is.
What are you waiting for? Do it! Just do it! Yes, you can!